Welcome to another episode of Fresh Corduroy. I'm your host, Craig Zolan. This week's guest is Christine Julia Feehan. Christine just finished 3 weeks of working the Kvitfjell and Hafjell World Cup ski races in Norway. She shares with us all the insights of putting on and hosting a World Cup race and the behind-the-scenes work and effort that's needed. Before that, she worked for FIS as the Director of Communications for Alpine Racing. She shares with us all of her insights about working with the athletes and conducting the press gaggle after the ski races. Before FIS, she worked as the editor-in-chief of skiracing.com, and prior to that was a ski coach at a number of ski academies throughout the U.S. Now, let's go rip some fresh corduroy with Christine. All right, welcome to another episode of Fresh Corduroy. Our guest today is Christine Julia Feehan. Christine, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, Craig. I think it's great the more skiing podcasts we have out there and what you're doing with Fresh Corduroy. You've had a couple guests so far, and it's very exciting and great people you've already spoken to. So I'm honored to be among one of the first people that are kicking this off.
Well, thank you for those kind words. We'll see how much of an honor it is once we're through. Listen, I enjoy it. I think there's, like you said, a lot of opportunity for more in this space, and broader was what I'm trying to accomplish. Not simply interviewing ski racers, but sort of more broadly skiing and people who love skiing generally. And so let's take it away. Let's start with your skiing origin story. How did you get started skiing, and when did you know you fell in love with it?
So maybe not as glamorous as a few other people, but my parents actually met in a ski lodge in New Jersey, of all places, at a now defunct resort called Craigmere. And I guess if your parents meet by skiing, then by default you're forced to ski at a young age. And my father still likes to tell the story that I actually hated skiing, probably until I was 12 or so. So I have two older brothers, and they were super fast and way better than I was, and I could never keep up. And I'd always be at the top of some completely gnarly, icy mogul trail somewhere on the East Coast, either in upstate New York or in Vermont, crying my eyes out while the whole rest of my family was at the bottom yelling, "Hurry up and get down here faster." Now my great claim to fame is I'm the best skier in the family. So I had a bit to overcome there for some years, but was an abysmally, tragically terrible racer, started way too late, but fell in love with the sport and transitioned pretty quickly into coaching. So I had a mentor, Jeff Peer, out of New Jersey, who had become the head coach at St. Lawrence of the NCAA team there. And he was very involved in coaches' education for U.S. ski and snowboard at the time. And so out of Whiteface, he kind of took me a bit under his wing and showed me the ropes a little bit. And very indebted to him, and unfortunately he passed away a few years ago. But Jeff was a great guy and kind of really got me into the coaching side of things.
That's terrific. You are now the second person who started skiing in New Jersey that's been on the podcast. Bobby Aldegari was the first and Olympic mogul skier. And he commented that there are more Olympic freestyle or mogul skiers hailing from New Jersey than any other state.
Him and Donna, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think New Jersey is a fine place to start skiing, but not too many people stay skiing there. So it's start your kids there, but maybe move them out when they're not too old.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've skied there. It's where I got my level 100 certification, was in the state of New Jersey. So have skied there and can ski in the summertime there now.
At the indoors.
At the mall.
Do your shopping, take a few runs.
Exactly. So you said you got started, you sort of moved into coaching the early days. I know you coached at Burke for some time. Where was that your first job, or were you start coaching at Whiteface prior to that?
Yeah, no, the first coaching job was actually with Ford Sayre Ski Club out of Hanover, New Hampshire. I was in grad school at Dartmouth at the time,
Yeah.
and so started coaching, I guess, what is now U16s at Ford Sayre with this guy, Gerd Reese, also one of these legends of
Yeah.
East Coast ski racing, and survived 2 seasons under Gerd, which I think was kind of like a tour of duty of sorts. He didn't say much, but people skied pretty fast with him. And after I finished grad school, I moved out west and I was coaching at Sugar Bowl Academy. So that was my first sort of full time after university coaching experience. And in the summer times when I was out there, I worked at the summer camp for Sarah and Aldo Radamus. So ended up, in reflection and looking back, under some pretty incredible mentors in the sport at a very early age. I mean, I was 22 years old or something at the time when I started coaching.
Yeah. Who you work with, obviously can have a huge impact on what you do and how you've learned, and so it's nice that people pass this knowledge along. And the people you're describing, Sarah and Aldo Radamus, are legends. For those who don't know, well, one, I guess maybe they're more famous today for their son, River, than they are for their coaching prowess. But they're both very accomplished coaches in their own right, and obviously have produced a kid who's done okay for himself. Who obviously had a great race in the GS this weekend.
He did. He was super happy through the finish area for sure. And I think one of the greatest things about the exposure that I had that Sarah offered was she really believed in hiring women and giving them an opportunity. And I spent 3 summers in Whistler, surrounded by other great women in the sport and in coaching, but also some really accomplished athletes. And a lot of, at the time, current US ski team members that had summer opportunities to coach and make a little bit of money, sort of up and coming athletes. And so many people from those summers ended up staying in the sport lifelong and well into their adulthood. So my sort of community of skiing really started then.
Yeah. I want to circle back. You mentioned you coached at Fort Sayre for a bit. It's an interesting model that I don't know that people know much about, because so much focus is placed on ski academies these days that these I don't know what the best term for Fort Sayre would be, but like I'll call it integrated clubs.
Yeah, or the
That
public school model, which you
Yeah,
do have in a few places. There's some opportunity in Vail, and I know in Canada they're trying to have a bit more of this like public school integration. Actually, Squaw Valley for a long time ran out of the Truckee Tahoe High School, another integrated program for their club. So they're not unheard of, but you're right, they're not necessarily the first thought that people have when they think, how can I solve this problem of my high school child being able to be on the road or being able to travel for competition at the number of days that they need to.
yeah. I mean, it's definitely not top of mind, and I don't think they look. Ski academies are in the business of marketing themselves as the pathway to skiing racing success. But there are these alternatives, for Sayre being one of them. Why don't you talk about the model a little bit, and just from what you remember, and any pros or cons that you can think of.
Going back a few decades at this
Yeah.
point, to be perfectly honest. But it was early release from the local high school. So the students, it was their gym class and then maybe another subject or so. So they were getting out pretty early in the afternoon and we still had daylight. We also had night training at the time in Lyme. So it was a good time on snow. I think comparable to the times I've spent. I worked at 3 different ski academies, and I think time on snow was probably fairly comparable. There was a transportation element always.
Hmm.
I think some parents had to do some driving. It wasn't a busing system or anything. Nowadays, parents drive their kids everywhere, so maybe no issue. But we needed some available parents at a certain time of day to help with transport.
Right.
And I think the nice thing about Fort Sayre, which is kind of maybe dying in certain clubs around the country, is that it was multi-sport. So they also had jumpers and they had cross-country skiers, maybe a little bit like Steamboat
Yeah.
Springs. And that intersection of having athletes in different disciplines and being able to understand what the jumpers are doing and what cross country is like, I think was also helpful.
Yeah. Again, for those who don't know, these are, groups, clubs that basically work with the local school systems to allow the kids to get out early and then participate in winter sport. And it's a significantly cheaper option than going to a ski academy.
You're paying your tax money anyway, right? So
Yeah.
if you can take advantage of it, you should. Downside is maybe that the private schools that I've seen tend to produce sort of career level skiers, and some of these public options maybe not quite the same development pathway. But there's so few kids that are going to make a lifetime career out of skiing.
Yeah.
So to have access to some of the other things that you get in a local public school and also not to have it hit your wallet quite as hard, I think is highly beneficial.
Yeah. It is. Maybe that'll be a subject for another episode.
A round table, maybe.
Yeah. That could definitely be a way of doing it. I haven't had a round table yet, so I have to experiment with that format. So after coaching, you made your way to skiracing.com or ski racing media as the editor in chief. Is that right?
It was a bit of a journey too. So I had 10 years of a coaching career and spent the majority of that time at Bird Mountain Academy, which I have now concluded is the place to spend your time if all you really care about is skiing, because there's not a whole lot else going on in the
Right.
Northeast Kingdom. But if skiing is your passion, or ski racing at least, and that's the thing you really want to focus on, and you don't care what else is going on in the world, and you want to be around other people that are like that, that's where they're all hanging out. And I had 6 years there in total, and I had gone to school to be a writer. So at some point, it kind of switch in the back of my head flipped, which was you need to use writing somehow. And the first lesson in writing is to write what you know. And I knew
Yeah.
skiing. So again, another connection, a guy by the name of Bryce Hubner, who had been a coach at Burke, gave me sort of oh, actually, no, was he a coach at Sugar Bowl? Oh, Bryce, you're going to kill me now because I can't remember.
Let's hope Bryce is listening.
Bryce definitely needs to listen. So Bryce Hubner was coaching. Maybe he coached at both places. Can't remember. But he gave me an in at Ski Racing Media. He had been covering the NCAA circuit and got like a real job and couldn't do it anymore, and recommended that I be the person that Gary Black, the owner of the publication at the time, hired to replace covering the NCAA circuit. And that was my first beat on a tour that I got to cover as a journalist. And I had a hell of a time doing it. It was awesome.
Yeah, it's a fun circuit to cover. Were you focused exclusively on the East, or did you cover or maybe you covered RIMSA primarily and not the East?
So I was living in the East still at the time, so covered both EISA and RIMSA, and then also got a contract through NCAA for the championships. I was running around like a crazy person, taking pictures, writing stories, shooting videos. I was doing everything. I built a platform in the back of my car at the time so I could sleep in my car. I was dirt bagging it,
Yes.
100%.
There are a few ski bums out there that do similar sorts of things, so not unfamiliar.
I remember pulling into a parking lot at some race, and like I had a Honda Element, these like Lego cars or whatever.
Yeah.
And I flipped open the back, and I had this raised platform with like my skis underneath and like a platform bed in the back. And one of the coaches walked by and was like, "Are you sleeping in there?" And I was like totally mortified. Kind of like, "Well, yeah, trying to like make ends meet." And he's like, "That is the sickest thing I've ever seen." was like, I'd much rather have a hotel room. But the second season, I had hotel rooms because then I had a little bit more money in the contracts and a stipend, and then
Right.
could afford to stay in places. But the first year, when you want to be an artist, you want to be a writer, got to go through some rough times, I think, to build
Yeah.
a character.
So you went from call it a beat reporter to running the publication.
Yeah,
How did
on
that
the
transition?
editorial side.
Yes.
So spent some time. It was only 2 seasons, kind of writing beat, and then I became the web editor that was responsible for the entire site. This was the same time that the company transitioned from being a print newspaper. So those that really are avid followers of ski racing remember you used to get once a month a print newspaper in your mailbox, and we just couldn't make that work financially, and the news was slow, right? Like by the time you got it, it was, race results in the back were super cool, but then you could get race results online. The stories were great, but the athlete that we were profiling then had been injured and wasn't even competing anymore. So to minimize the time between sort of the news cycle and the information, there was no choice other than to convert, to a website. And for a few years, we still had a digital magazine. So we would run the website, and then we would also publish monthly this digital PDF magazine that would come out. And then eventually we also scrapped the digital magazine and went pure website. So I ran the website also for 2 years, and then became editor in chief, running the editorial side in partnership with Claire Biesmeyer, Tommy's wife now, and she was the chief operating officer, handling the business side, and Gary Black was the publisher and owner. And he also passed away, unfortunately, in the time that we were working there. But that guy gave, more of his heart and soul into the sport of skiing, and his dollars too, than a lot of people I've come across. So have to send some blessings his way as well.
Interesting. You mentioned, working with Claire. I had no idea of that connection, but I always, remark that the ski racing community in particular is extremely small. The degrees of separation is certainly not six; it's one or two.
Yeah, sometimes even a half. And I love, one of my favorite things to do is to solve a problem in the ski community that involves, like, I have to get this item from this location to this location, right? Like somebody left their boots behind at a race in Slovenia, and they're starting in 2 days in Levi, Finland. Like, how are we going to get them there? And the calls that end up getting made in order for this to happen, it happens all the time, and it's one of my favorite things to see.
I'm not sure if I'm surprised or not that someone, left their boots behind and need them before a start in a couple of days. Remarked before we started recording, obviously, that was chasing my son out the door, making sure that he had all his necessary items before his trip. And one might expect it from a 18, 19-year-old boy. A professional ski racer, perhaps, a little less so, but I guess it still happens.
Hate to point fingers, but on the World Cup level, there's more than one pair of boots and a lot of people that are responsible for moving equipment from one
Yes.
location to the other. It's like a doubles tennis match. Sometimes the ball goes right up the middle.
Yeah. That's a very good metaphor for what could happen. So your time at ski racing, obviously this major transition period, moving from the analog to digital world, and pretty exciting. I remember those days, more broadly, just in terms of the industry, media in general, tumultuous. People were uncertain, but you weathered the storm. I think the publication is still doing well, and an active and loyal fan base, at least, readership here in the U.S. at least. But that must have expanded your eyes to other things going on, and you kept wanting more, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a consequence that follows me everywhere in life. I'm always kind of looking for the next level, and it's probably the athlete mindset that I can't break or get away from. I think when I was at ski racing media, we had to develop a lot of content partnerships in order to keep things afloat for a period of time. Subscription models are not really driving media anymore, and people were breaking through paywalls left and right. And we had a really small staff too, but people were really busting their butts trying to cover all the different circuits. I was writing World Cup, even though I was managing the website. It'd be up at 3 o'clock in the morning on the East Coast, and also traveling some to Europe. But we had a content partnership with NBC because they didn't want to pay to send reporters on site for races in Europe. They would have analysts and studio and everything on site in the North American races. But when the tour went to Europe, they were kind of like looking, okay, how can we make this a little bit more affordable for us? How could ski racing make its coverage a little bit more affordable? So we cracked some content partnerships, and a few different writers from ski racing over the course of maybe 5 or 6 years got to spend quite a bit of time in Europe and shooting finish line interviews with recording rights. So that was kind of my first step into, okay, now I'm really on the World Cup. I'm not writing about the World Cup from my computer at home, but I'm standing in the finish area and I'm talking face to face with athletes. And then they get to know you. And then you get to know other journalists and other media members on tour, and the whole international media world opens. You see how the Austrian journalists and the Swiss journalists are covering the sport and how intense they are. And they're fighting for these bylines and they're trying to get every little piece of detailed information out of coaches and servicemen, and what's the rumor, and what's this new piece of equipment, and I saw this new plate on the ski, and how come they're on marker bindings but they're not skiing on a comparable company. And it was like, okay, that is a journalist working for people who love every piece of information they can get about the sport. And I think that definitely influenced my style of writing and how hungry, like, talk about always wanting more. Got very hungry for that news cycle and that immediacy.
Is there the same interest level here in the U.S. as there is in Europe? You talk about people who want to understand the plate, or whether or not they're mixing and matching ski and binding manufacturers and whatever else they're concocting. I mean, maybe there are a few of us who are that into it, that would want to know that. But is the appetite for that level of information the same here in the U.S. as it is abroad, or is it geographically dependent?
If you're talking about the masters population, probably like 45 plus. The answer is yes. And like you said, a few people that really are kind of teching out and geeking out on it, but maybe not to the same degree. I mean, the other thing you also get in the European press is who's dating who and who is holding hands and who is this, that, and the other. And I'm not sure there's the same appetite for that, the ski celebrity vibe in the US either. So it's probably a bit more, in order to care about ski racing in the US, I think you had to grow up as a ski racer. Whereas there are more casual watchers of ski racing in Europe that maybe did not race themselves.
Yeah, interesting. So I think I'll circle back to that point. But once we kind of conclude this journey through your career, so you're now in the Finnish corral of World Cup races, but with ski racing media, and in partnership with NBC. That I don't know if there's anything more to talk about ski racing, but it does conclude, and you move from there to a more international stage.
Yeah, I had 1 year of overlap actually, because when you're conducting interviews in the Finnish corral of a World Cup, you're on one side of the fence, and all of the coaches and teams and staff are on the other side of the fence. And after not too long, I think I got the attention of the FIS and their media and communications department. And they had a position, it's one of the 5 permanent positions that travels on the tour all season long, that opened. And so I was contacted and asked, would you be interested in taking this position? But it's only seasonal. So we only need you during the World Cup season. And of course, the pay wasn't that enticing. But I talked with Gary and I sort of said, hey, I think I can pull off doing both. I think I can still, fulfill the work that you need done for ski racing. And I can also take this opportunity to get the experience with FIS and to understand the sport a little bit more from behind the scenes. It required kind of a Chinese wall because I couldn't take sort of trade secrets from FIS and early feed them to ski racing. So my professional integrity had to be very sharp and intact. But it was. And I think it was a very challenging winter that year. I pulled it off, but not without it taking a huge toll on me. And also, that was the winter that Gary unfortunately passed away, and that hit the staff extra hard. We had another writer, longtime writer, Hank McKee, who, if people have read ski racing, you have read a million articles written by Hank McKee. And he also died that winter. So emotionally very difficult. And I was in Europe traveling, and it was my first year working for FIS. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. Everybody thought I did. They're like, oh, you've been around and you look like you've got it covered. Like, I was flying by the seat of my pants. So at the end of that winter, it was clear there was no way I was going to be able to do both going forward. And at the same time, FIS said, okay, we'll expand the role because we'd like you to stay. And that meant I had to say goodbye, unfortunately, to ski racing media. But Claire was still there, and they were able to hire a new editor-in-chief, and I stayed on until that transition occurred. So I think left them in pretty okay hands.
That's really interesting that you were able to do both simultaneously. One, obviously, the workload that you were able to juggle that simultaneously is terrific, but also that you're looking at the product, for lack of a better term, from two different perspectives. The one who's serving it up, for lack of a better term, and the other, that's the consumer of it or processor of it that ultimately disseminates it to the audience. And having those different lenses and perspectives is pretty interesting, I imagine, besides the information barrier that you needed to maintain.
Yeah, and I think that it was maybe only possible because I was working for a US publication. If I had been writing for an Austrian newspaper, there's no way that they would have allowed multiple positions at the same time. But ski racing media was a very non-threatening media outlet,
Right.
on the World Cup tour. And there wasn't much challenge necessarily from Swiss publications, from TV, from anyone. And that allowed me in a way, I think, to understand that from a media perspective. Like, I never saw that as a competitive environment, but a World Cup finish corral can be quite competitive with journalists, kind of elbowing and trying to get the first interview and getting a little physical and territorial and boxing out space. And I always felt like I would sit around and wait 20 minutes for the athlete to get the very last interview because I knew that nobody was going to ask the same question that I was going to ask.
And what are those questions that you would ask? It's not what where they had their date the last weekend. I'm assuming is something different than that.
Yeah, I tried definitely not to ask too many personal questions. Um, Probably more from a coaching perspective. A lot of, what did you think of your result? Not how did you feel, right? This like, oh, you won. How did you feel? It's a very easy question for anyone to ask. The answer is always going to be, I felt great. I won the race. Right?
Right.
It's never going to be that I didn't feel great. But when I was working for the FIS, I had to conduct the finish line flash interview with every winner. So you have a very short amount of time to prepare for exactly what you're going to ask. So you have to come into the second run with an assessment of which individuals you think have a potential to win, what their historical record is at that location. Is there some specific record they're about to break? Like, you have to have all of this just kind of sitting in your head so that when the final skier in a tech race crosses the finish line and you actually know who won, you can pull out two questions. You have to fill about 30 seconds of airtime. You almost never do that with one question alone. So you have to have two or three questions kind of sitting in your head that you're able to ask that are not necessarily the same question you asked them the year before. And I was doing this job the time when Michaela Schifrin was winning basically every single weekend. And it's kind of like Groundhog Day. How do I come up with another question for
Right.
Michaela to make sure that a global TV audience is entertained to some extent and is getting good information out of her, and getting some personal connection to her when she's finishing a race and winning.
Obviously not with Michaela, but is there a language issue in asking those questions with some of the athletes? I mean, you're an English speaker. I don't know if you speak other languages as well, but I know the questions are asked and answered in English. How much of a challenge is that?
Absolutely depends on the athlete, but I think from doing they're called like ENG zone interviews, you start to know who's comfortable and confident in their English and who is not. Now, I think many more World Cup athletes that end up winning a race or in the leader box have some confidence with English. And the flash interview is always in English. But Beat Feuz, he refused to do flash interviews in English. He would only speak Swiss German. So even if you asked the question in English, he was going to be answering it in Swiss German.
Wonderful.
Amazing skier, not to say that his skiing isn't incredible, and he's a super nice guy, but his feeling was, I'm going to speak my native language, and he was fine with it. He owned it. I think what's maybe more impressive are the number of athletes that spend a lot of time learning German, knowing that you're potentially going to have higher market value if you can conduct interviews across multiple languages, but English and German being the two most important. So I know Lindsey Vonn spent a summer studying German, if not 2 summers, at a program out of Dartmouth. And Axel Lund Svindal was speaking perfectly fluent German and as happy to conduct interviews in either language. And they were able to move right down all of the TV stations, all the media boxes, and switch like it was no problem. And the ones that are like, no, I will not do an interview in a certain language, it becomes more limiting for them to have the exposure that's probably going to keep you earning money for longer in the sport.
Interesting. So that's one of the areas that would want to touch on, which is call it the marketability of ski racing. And I'm jumping ahead, or we're jumping chronologically. You obviously you worked for FIS for a number of years. You left, went into other industries, and you're wearing well, what are you wearing? The Kvitvel. I'm butchering the pronunciation. Oh, it's both. It's double. I can't. So the Norwegian World Cup well, not World Cup races, men and women, from this past 3 weeks period. So having a chance to have stepped back, like again, where does ski racing in general need to improve I'll call it its product to make it more appealing to the U.S.? I focus on U.S. because I think there is, and maybe you should explain that, there is a difference between the consumption of ski racing in Austria, Switzerland, elsewhere in Europe, than it is here in the U.S., and how remarkably different it is. So why don't you chat about that first?
Part of the answer to that question lies in the reason why I left my job at the FIS. And I did 3 years as media coordinator, and also helping manage the TV interests in the sport. And at the time, under the previous presidency, we had very extreme restrictions around content production at World Cup sites. So ski racing is one of the few, if only, sports where the TV and media rights for the sport do not lie in the international governing body of sport. So one of the reasons you can have documentaries on Formula One is because Formula One retains their own media rights. Biathlon, IBU, International Biathlon Union, they retain their own media rights. So if you work for that federation, you can grant rights for people to come in and have access to your sport in whatever way you want. In skiing, on anything other than biathlon, we have a decentralized rights holder model that will still be in play for the next 2 years. So they have negotiated the centralization of this for all countries except for Austria at this point, but we're still sitting in another 2-year window before that kicks in. And my job ended up being very much about policing individuals from being able to create content. So you can't have your phone out, you can't be filming, you can't be taking pictures here, you're not allowed to go there, you're not allowed to be here. And I also had responsibility for producing a behind the scenes YouTube series. And even I didn't have rights to film certain things.
Right.
And everyone was just angry all the time. They'd be like, well, I just want to take this shot and I want it. And I was like, I want you to do it too. Because I think that it would be better for the sport. I think we do need more exposure. We do need more of the special interest stories. We do need more of an understanding of what it's like to actually ski down a World Cup track, which I just did for 3 weeks and my leg is killing me. I know I was getting old, but like this is like next level old. But it needs more exposure beyond just the race, right? And that's the way other sports are doing it. Golf is doing it, tennis is doing it, and we definitely have those stories and that intensity, that drama. Believe me, there is enough drama on the World Cup to keep this going. I can assure you of that.
Let's talk. Can we? We don't have a camera out in the corral. Let's talk about the drama. What is the drama that? Share with us, some of the drama from the last 3 weeks.
Oh, I'm not. I can't go into that drama. That's too. It's way too recent. But you know, there's always an athlete, and we will say no names of anyone that does this, but they're trying to find competitive advantages. So people just doing little things, little sneaky things here and there, and getting caught. And, oh, did you hear they did this or that? And it's not necessary. It's not a doping thing, right? It's like, oh, they were checking out the course before they were supposed to. Their service guy went and had a look, and now the service guy's banned and he can't come on the hill for the next few days. Complaints about the weather, right? Why are we going here? Why are we going there? Why is the calendar the way the calendar is? How come this race was canceled and replaced with that discipline, but not the discipline I wanted it to be replaced with? The finish area itself, the emotions and intensity, the amount of equipment that's being broken or thrown. I don't think it's a good example for young kids, and I think the sponsor should start to have an issue with it at some point. But there's high energy, high intensity, high passion.
And so we need, a Netflix series similar to F1.
Drive to Survive.
Drive to Survive, similar to the canceled, the Breakpoint for tennis and
Full Swing for golf.
Yeah. Exactly. So it probably does set up well for such a type, that type of series. But so there's this structural challenge today, is what you're saying, in terms of the broadcast rights that prevent that from happening for at least another 2 years, if not longer, right? You said in 2 years, it'll be all centralized with the exclusion of Austria. Is that right?
With the exclusion of Austria for now. Yeah. There are companies and there are producers that right now are filming. So there's a movie, Downhillers, that is supposed to come out. The Strife from Red Bull was produced. So it is possible. But the openness also around filming, I think there's an evolution that's now happening. So the first is that the FIS has increased its media and marketing staff, and they have digital director and they have a TV director. So they're also trying to push more media production. You probably on social media have seen clips over the past 2 seasons, a lot more immediate clips of racing. The athletes now have access to their own runs, which they didn't have when I was working there. They weren't allowed to put their own run out after the race. Only their national governing body could, and it had to be 30 seconds or less. So, I kind of got to a point where I said, there's no innovation happening here. I worked, on a corporate side in innovation and change management. I'm always trying to make things better than they are when I walk in the door. And I said, I've done everything I can. 3 years and kind of uphill grind, and I didn't see it getting any more open. If anything, I saw it getting more closed off. I took some time and sort of stepped away. And then 2 years ago, I was hired by the World Cup organizing committee for the finals in Andorra. And that is an organization, a local organizing committee that was making a bid for world championships, but they didn't host an annual World Cup. So they had really great expert professionals at their resort at running resort events. They've got a Tour de France stage that's come through. They do major mountain biking events in the summer, really great at hosting major events, but on the ski sports side, maybe not the expertise of knowing all the rules of the World Cup or how the finish area needs to be built. So they hired in some experts that they knew from other venues and other resorts in the past. And that, they said, can you come and help on the media side for us? And another American colleague of mine who was responsible for ceremonies in Beaver Creek and also previously at Killington, she got hired to come over and run ceremonies for them. So kind of brought us in as mercenary freelancers for a couple weeks. And while I was there, that was the first time I ever worked for an organizing committee. So each thing I've done is kind of like opened the door to a new angle of the sport. And from that point on, I was like, okay, organizing committee is really interesting to me and going forward and in the future. And I stepped away from my corporate job just at the start of February with a severance agreement that gave me some space and time to play a little bit. And so the first thing I thought about playing at was this 3-week World Cup event going on between Kvitfjell and Hafjell. And it was a historic event because it's the first time in history that a single organizer has done 3 consecutive weeks of racing. And I knew that they were going to have big challenges and big needs. And I said, I happen to just have some free time all of a sudden, and can you use me in some capacity? And they said, absolutely. Get in the car and come on up here.
That's terrific. We didn't say it explicitly, but seeing as you've just spent 3 weeks in the Norwegian mountains, that you are based in Oslo. So for those that are wondering, you're not an American in Paris, you're an American in Oslo. Although I also know that do you now have dual citizenship?
Yeah, so while I was in Kvitfjell, I'd filed all the application and paperwork for this just a few weeks ago. And I was told that it could take up to 2 years to process. And I've been here 5.5 years now, kind of got tired of renewing the permanent residency over and over again and paying the fee. And I guess I'm probably the envy of a few other Americans at this time. But I swear I put in my years. I had to learn the language. I had to take a citizenship test. I'm not sure all Norwegians could even pass, much like individuals have to undergo to immigrate to the U.S., and also have paid enough money into the tax scheme at this point that the approval came through extremely fast. So I basically woke up one morning in Kvitfjell and I was like, oh, I'm Norwegian now. Okay.
Changes everything, right?
It opens the world, actually, in a way. So though Norway is not part of the EU, I have living and working rights in any European country for the rest of my life, and that means a lot to me also. Not just, I think the Norwegian heritage as well, and the ski heritage that exists in this country is really special, but I've always been a bit of a citizen of the world, and to have that flexibility too now, to come and go as I please anywhere in Europe and not have to worry about, the time constraints or anything is great.
That is awesome. So you worked for the organizing committee. I saw from your social media you were on the slopes a lot. What was your role, or was it a wearer of many hats?
I was wearing no hats, luckily, so I wasn't actually in charge of anything on this go around. The organizing committee for Kvitfjell is very well established, and they have longtime leaders of both course and slope and media, and really great, dedicated, and committed people that have been working for many years in Kvitfjell. And Hafjell, this was the first time that they were hosting a World Cup in several decades. And so just in general, more hands were needed. But I was coming in from an expert advisor standpoint. And the organizer has now been awarded World Cup finals for next year. So my involvement over the past 3 weeks was floating through a little bit of everything so that I could get to know the people that had the positions of leadership and responsibility. I could get to know the organizers a little better. I did not know them from when I was on tour because the women didn't have a World Cup in Kvitfjell when I worked for the FIS. So they were new organizers to me.
Yeah.
And I think it's important, no matter where you go in life, that you don't just come barging through the doors and trying to make suggestions on how to change something or even take control over something. Really, this was a period of observation for me. So I ended up a little bit of everywhere. And that did include the back office. So the first week, kind of handling accreditation for the teams and helping organize some issues that popped up. Right, you always need a firefighter here and there. I think the administrative head told me I was the chief chaos pilot. I hope I wasn't creating the chaos. I was trying to minimize it. And then in the second week, we were a little short of people on course. So put on the ski boots again and just got out there and helped slip and helped fix some gates and kind of felt like the good old days again. And then this past week when we were for the tech races in Hoffville, also a little bit of mix of everything and helping in ceremonies.
Wonderful. Tell us a little bit about it's called the White Circus, the circus that is a World Cup event. Obviously, most people, the spectators, focus on the racing action, but there's a lot more to it that goes on. So what is the logistics and the whole scene behind the scenes at a World Cup race?
It really depends on the location to the extent that when you're in Central Europe, a lot of the teams are arriving by their own transport. When you come up to the north, that's not necessarily the case. So some teams do drive vehicles all the way up, and we had a lot of teams that did that. But you do have a transportation office because you got to get everybody on site. And that includes also FIS officials and your technical delegate, and everyone's got to get there. So that's where when I'm talking about an organizing committee, I like to start with first we have to get the people there. So how do we get them there? And then where are they staying when they come? So all accommodation for every individual, which includes a start list. Maybe you have 60 athletes on the start list, and you can kind of multiply that by 3 to understand sort of field size of staff that's traveling, right, depending on if it's a small nation where it's one athlete with 5 or 6 people traveling with them, or something larger like the Italians that I think had like 45 people in total that were traveling. So you have these big delegations, you have to find beds. It's a bit of a puzzle because a national team wants to stay all together in the same hotel. You don't want to have to split people between hotels. And the numbers aren't always adding up completely perfectly. You maybe have 5 extra rooms in one hotel, but not a team small enough to put them in those 5 extra rooms. So we get the people there, then we have to make sure they have a place to sleep. Then they have to eat all the time. Not just like at the race, but they have to eat before the race. They have to eat during the race. They have to eat after inspection. So you have team hospitality, and you have the food and beverage sort of for all. Then you have to realize that the athletes are the individuals that are producing the show, but you also have fans that are coming on site. They're your spectators and your audience, and you have sort of 2 groups of them because you have the paid public general admission tickets, and then you have a VIP. And VIP service, of course, is going to be next level. So there's food and bev and event planning and activity for VIP, bringing in some previous celebrity skiers from your country, getting the current athletes after the ceremonies to maybe parade through your VIP tent and grab a microphone and say something great to the crowd. So you have the VIP aspect of the show. And then it really breaks down to, are you at a place where they're going to go like big style? You're at a Swiss race and you have an air show and we're flying airplanes over the top and we have to talk about the coordination of when the planes are flying over the top of the course? Or is it a little bit more mellow and low key like we have in Norway, where we didn't do any public bib draws? There was no big fanfare or spectacle going on. It was really focused a bit more on the skiing.
Interesting. I didn't know. I saw a video, obviously, of the races and the crowd size. Much smaller, mellower in Norway than it is at some of those major European races. So I guess it's pretty varied. Like having toured with the Women's World Cup, you can go from, I mean, here in the U.S., Killington, which is pretty big and raucous, to something a bit more subdued. I wonder when it was there, and I don't know if you traveled there, Lake Louise.
Yeah. So I'd say Vitteville and Lake Louise Finnish area quite similar.
Yeah, it's much more mellow and perhaps more similar to a USSA, U16 race. Maybe that might be more intense with the parents of U16 racers.
Yeah, and the thing though is the variety is important because the calendar is so jam-packed. You've got like 45 races a season per gender. And if every single weekend was like Killington, if every single weekend was like Kitzbühel, if every single weekend was like Flachau, the athletes would be totally, completely annihilated with side programs and crowds and individuals just being able to get to the finish area to do their jobs. Walking through a parade of people and a crowd. In Austria, a lot of times they're dropping beers on you. I mean, it really is a spectacle, but you have to remember people are trying to work and everyone's trying to keep their energy up from the end of October until the end of March. So I think that the difference in crowd size and sort of the difference in programming is really appreciated by everyone. So every place kind of has its charm, and Killington was amazing because look at how important women's ski racing is in the eastern US, and totally really pumped up energy there. But almost just as nice to be in a cozy cabin on Kvitfjell and be able to ski in and ski out and go back and have your hot chocolate or your coffee after inspection and before you have to go out for the race.
Yeah, we talked with Doug Lewis, and he mentioned during his day at Kitzbühel, it was 30 minutes or longer to get from the finish area to back to the lift, just to make, and that's on a training day, right? Race day was much worse, so I could see how a more subdued environment would be welcomed by the racers and the other staff. Because having to face that every single race weekend would be difficult, to say the least.
Yeah, Schladming 2013 World Championships was the first major event that I covered, and I absolutely struggled to get where I needed to on time based solely on the crowds. Great problem to have,
Yeah.
but also it was a huge challenge.
Yeah. So in our remaining time, let's talk about Schladming is I don't know, near the pinnacle, if not the pinnacle, of sort of like ski racing in the sense of crowd size and showmanship. How do we in the U.S. I think in terms of World Cup events here in the U.S. they're well attended. I mean, Killington certainly is. Beaver Creek, I think, is. I wonder how. Yeah, less so. I wonder how Sun Valley might be a little bit more even sleepier. But how do we get the excitement, or do we not? Just simply because the U.S. is inundated with other sports that draw the vast majority of the population. How do you improve the standing of ski racing in the U.S.? Is it simply getting a Netflix show, or are there other things to be done? Because I think one of the challenges, particularly for U.S. ski racers, unless you're Michaela, maybe a few other exceptions, like it's difficult to make a real living as a ski racer. I guess Lindsey Vonn, now that she's back active, I can include her in that list. How do you make a living as a ski racer? Because here in the U.S., because the attention just isn't there. So do you have any other, thoughts, having taken a hiatus and stepped away from it for a bit?
I think the biggest challenge that people are seeing in the US this season related to the sport is TV access. So I know it's multiple platforms in order to watch a race. I was home at Christmas time and wanted to watch a race, and it was a bit like, does anyone know what this is on or how. And of course, I'm always figuring out I can watch anything at any time somewhere, not necessarily in a totally legal manner, but I'm not going to miss something
Right.
because it's not broadcast in a location that I'm at. But I think American fans this year have really struggled, and I've seen the complaints on social media, and it's kind of never ending, and it carried all the way into World Championships because they were also hosted in Austria, and then even if you paid for whatever season access, then that wasn't included, and if you can't watch it on TV, I think that's worse. Even if you need a separate subscription and you're in the know and you have one platform that you can watch it on, great. Going to a World Cup race live, I think, is a great experience for people to have, but I don't think that's what's going to fire people up about the sport. And I'm much more concerned about keeping youth in the sport and the sport itself growing in the US than the show necessarily growing. But it's primarily a television product. So growing the TV product and then giving anyone in the US that wants, even if they have to pay for the access, but a simple way to do that, streamlined, to me is the first challenge and obstacle to get over.
Yeah, and the it is challenging because one of the first things I get in the mornings World Cup race is a text from a friend saying, "Which channel is it on today?" Or what platform? And I don't always have the answer because I don't know. And to be honest, FIS I don't think does a good job of mentioning it. They do put out an Instagram story that says where you can watch it, and North America is always excluded from the list. It has every other continent and country listed but North America. Perhaps because it's so convoluted here.
I don't want Americans also to feel like they're alone in this struggle because this year in Norway, we also didn't necessarily know week to week which rights holder had the broadcast rights. And there were some weeks in some races in Austria where nobody carried the rights in Norway, the country of skiing.
Interesting. Look, we've kind of run over, but what else is there anything else you wanted to talk about? I know you have a women's program coming up. Is that something you want to talk about?
I'd love just a short moment to plug this because it's
Yeah.
something else I'm really passionate about and getting involved in. As a result of having a coaching career where I didn't necessarily, I talked about Sarah, who I think was an amazing female role model for me, but other women in the sport kind of uplifting those that want to work in the sport of skiing, and whether that's as a coach or an instructor or in media or wherever. And there's a new organization that's being formed out of a group of individuals from the US and Canada and also some representatives from other countries called the World Women's Snowsport Organization. And we're running our first annual summit in April in Kitzsteinhorn, Austria, and trying to gather like-minded women from around the world to potentially see where there are synergies between coaching and instructing and serving as sort of mentor leaders for other women in the sport going forward. So there's information, wwso.pro on Instagram if you want to follow that journey. Very early stages, but some really passionate women are involved in it, and I'm happy to be among those.
That sounds terrific. I've talked about it here before that we need more women in the sport, in the coaching, and not just competing, but it's about the other things around it. Is this program or organization solely for alpine, or is it inclusive of other snow sports?
Inclusive of other snow sports. So at the summit, we have snowboard also, and I know that there's an intention for cross country to come into the mix, but the founding members are primarily on alpine and also mountaineering side. So sort of starting there with backcountry and with alpine racing and alpine skiing and some snowboard, and it will expand beyond there.
Terrific. I wish you the best of luck in that. Thank you very much for joining me on today's episode. It's wonderful speaking with you. learned a lot. We can go on for more. I do want to dig into who's dating who, but we can do that privately. And let's work on that Netflix episode or
I'd
series.
probably be better off answering the question about the bindings and the plates, but I could take that too.
We can talk about that too. I'm more than happy. At least you didn't say the drama was somebody turning down the DIN settings of someone else's bindings.
I mean, there's been some sabotage claims around fluoro testing, but so far none of them have been substantiated.
Okay. You heard it here first. Well, thank you again, Christine. I really appreciate it. It really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, and best of luck in the podcast, and go find some fresh corduroy.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Thank you for listening to another episode of Fresh Corduroy. I had a great time chatting with Christine. She is a great person, and hearing the stories from within the finish corral and frankly within the netting at a World Cup race is really interesting. I wish we got more of that as consumers of media around the World Cup and ski racing in general here in North America. I am hopeful that the changes she described will lead to better coverage and more information and just more drama being portrayed on the TV in the future. I also thought it was really insightful to hear what it's like working a World Cup race or a series of World Cup races in this case. There's a lot of effort put on behind the scenes in order to pull off an event. And I think that goes for the World Cup level as well as the little U10, U12 races that happen around the country. I encourage everyone to participate, to volunteer, to help out a race, whether it's at your local hill, whether it could be gatekeeping or course maintenance, simply slipping or bringing jackets down, but getting up close and personal to the action and seeing the excitement from the racers and the coaches and being inside the netting is great. And also the sport certainly needs volunteers whenever it can get them. So whether that's at your local hills U10, U12 race or at a NORAM Cup or even a World Cup race at Killington or perhaps Beaver Creek or Sun Valley, I encourage you to participate. There's a lot of opportunity and people are always welcoming new volunteers. With that, I look forward to joining you on the next podcast, in the next episode. And till then, go enjoy some fresh corduroy.